Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm James Conlon, music director of Los Angeles Opera. This is called Coffee with Conlon. I have my coffee cup right here. It's my second one today, so it's smaller than usual. What I do each time we have one of these meetings is I read questions that have been sent in by you, the audience, and then I try to answer them as best I can. And so to keep ourselves all busy, interested, and alive while we find our way through the COVID crisis, I think this is a great way to do it. Keep thinking about music, opera, and while we stay safe and healthy. So I do have some great questions today, and I'm going to first read the question, and then I'll try to give the best answer I can. Now, the first question doesn't have a signature, but I know it's somebody who not just comes to the opera, but comes to the pre-performance talks that I give. Hello, Maestro. At the latest performance of La Traviata, that's about a year ago, you had a very interesting presentation about Alphonsine Plessis and Count von Stackelberg, the historic figures on whom Violetta and the Baron were based. You had mentioned a second count in either La Traviata or in another Verdi opera. This was a person so obscure that you were confident no one in the audience would discover this person. Who was it? And thanks. Well, yes, nobody ever came forward. Now, this is actually more of a parlor game, and it's sort of fun. But there is a character, and he's a count who actually was probably present at the end of the opera, what would be the story of the end of the opera of both La Traviata and Un ballo in maschera. And who is that person? Well, let's back up a little bit. We'll remind you first that Un ballo in maschera is based on a true story of King Gustav III of Sweden, who was assassinated at a masked ball. Okay, that's March of 1792. And so the story is based on that. Now, at the time, there was a Russian ambassador, and his name was Otto Magnus von Stackelberg. And he was there with his family at the ball, and that is there's testimony to that. And with him was his son, amongst others, and that son was named Gustav Ernst Stackelberg. Okay, now fast forward to La Traviata. The son, Stackelberg, had as his father was a very distinguished diplomat. Also, the son had a career, and it went through Switzerland and Holland and on to Italy. And after going to Vienna for the Congress of Vienna, at the end of all of that, he retires and he goes to Paris. And he spends his last years. He's an elderly man at this point. And who does he take for a lover? None other than Marie Duplessis, or Marguerite Gautier, as she's known in Alexandre Dumas, the son's novel, or Violetta Verdi, who is, of course, La Traviata. So sometime around 1844, 45, he meets her at a spa. He goes back to Paris and actually puts her in an apartment across the street from his own, where he lives with his family. And he is one of her lovers. Now, it is said that the Baron who is in this, the Baron who is at times Violetta's lover in the opera, is actually based on von Stackelberg. He was one of two ex-lovers who were present at her funeral and presumably were with her in her last days. And we actually know that that Count von Stackelberg was paying the rent of that apartment where theoretically we believe she died. He was already a man close to 80, and so he could be said to be present in the last act of La Traviata, at least in the form of the man paying the rent for the apartment, if not physically. But he also seems to have represented the Baron Dufour in the opera. And of course, he is present at the assassination of King Gustavo Gustav in Sweden in 1792. Now, this is really a parlor game, but if you want to test out your friends, try them out on this one. Okay, you can look all of this up on Wikipedia. This was brought to my attention by a colleague of mine in Italy who's a librarian, and he brought this whole story to me years ago, and I always thought it was a nice one. So I hope you share that story with all of your friends. Now, let me, for a moment, I'm looking through the questions here. Let me stay with Verdi for the moment. Here's a question from Catherine Pfeiffer, and she said, I was struck by the beautiful duet between the baritones in Don Carlos. In the opera repertoire, are there many of these? Well, again, to stick with Verdi at a certain point became interested in all of the possibilities of having two low voices, either to a baritone and a bass, two basses. A significant model for this was written by Bellini in I Puritani, which was written in 1835. But the first significant one that I can think of in Verdi, and I could count to 9 duets, was between Charles V, who was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, appears in the opera Ernani with the bass Silva. By 1847, there's a significant one between Macbeth and Banquo in the first scene when the witches make their first prophecy. Verdi is getting interested in this color. Then there are 2 villains in Louisa Miller a few years later in 1849. One is a count, it's Count Walter. He is the father of the man who is in love with Louisa Miller. And he has a secretary assistant named Wurm. And they are evil, and they have a very significant duet. That's probably the biggest one so far. 2 years later, 1851, Rigoletto meets the assassin Sparafucile in the back alley, and they have a dark conversation. And Rigoletto will come back to him and hire him to murder the Duke in the last act, but unfortunately, through his daughter's understanding of it, she sacrifices herself instead. So Rigoletto, of course, is a tragic figure on many scores, but including he has organized with Sparafucile, he's responsible for the murder of his own daughter. Now, if you move ahead a few years to 1857, Simon Boccanegra is a baritone. He is what's called the Doge of Genova. That means that's like a prince. It's the title that they took from the Venetian Republic, Doge. And with a nobleman by the name of Fiesco. There is bad blood between the two of them for the course of 25 years, and they have 2 duets together that bookend the story. One is at the beginning of the story. Fiesco's daughter, Maria, has just died after having born an illegitimate child to Simon Boccanegra. Fiesco says to Boccanegra, give me the child and I will forgive you. And Boccanegra laments because the child is lost. By the last act, he has found the child and he presents that to Fiesco, that fact, as well as the daughter herself, but he has already been poisoned by an enemy and he is dying. So those 2, baritone Simon Boccanegra and bass Fiesco, bookend that wonderful, marvelous opera, Simon Boccanegra. Now, talking about Un ballo in maschera, which is 1859, there isn't really a duet, but there is a scene of a trio, 2 basses and a baritone. And they are, in fact, at this point, conspiring together to assassinate. The character is called Riccardo because the censors made Verdi change all the characters. But we know it's actually King Gustav of Sweden. And the baritone has turned against his friend, the king, whereas the 2 conspirators had been enemies of the king from the beginning of the opera. It becomes a trio. So it's not quite a duet, but it is a combination of those factors. Here's another fascinating one, almost comic. La Forza del Destino, 1862. We have a scene in a monastery, and there is a Padre Guardiano, who is the elder, the head of the monastery, and he's a very religious and serious man. And then there's a grumbling sort of comic friar whose name is Fra Melitone. And they have what is almost a comic duet between the two of them in that wonderful, big, sprawling opera. Now, when we get to Don Carlo, which is 1867, there are two great duets between King Philip II and the Marquis of Posa, also known as Rodrigo, who is a young idealist and who has a confrontation with the king. And later there is the king with the Grand Inquisitor, who have another confrontation. This is one of the great scenes of all opera between these two powerful personalities, the head of the Spanish Empire and the head of the Grand Inquisition. And we see that even the king of Spain has to kneel before the Grand Inquisition. This is one of the most powerful scenes in all of opera. Verdi by now has become very sophisticated of how to play these dark voices against one another. And the final example is a comic one, 1893. It's between Sir John Falstaff and the husband of one of the women he is courting, whose name is Mr. Ford. He comes in disguised, and of course, this is a long scene and a very delightful one, where Verdi, in a certain sense, is making fun of himself and all of the melodramas he has written. So there you have two baritones. But Verdi developed the art of a confrontation of two low voices. Here's a question from Ray Busman. Maestro, you worked for decades in Cologne, Paris, Torino. When and how did you learn to speak German, French, and Italian? And what other languages can you understand? Do you mostly speak to singers in their native tongue? Thank you for the question, Ray. So there's two parts of that question, actually. When and where did I learn these languages? I actually started learning them in my late teens and early 20s, and did that in rapid fire succession, actually German first, Italian second, and French third. But after that point, I've been speaking them all of my life. And what other languages have I come into contact with? Well, Spanish, which I don't speak as proficiently as German, French, and Italian, but I did study it in school. And my wife is bilingual Spanish, so there was a lot of speaking in the family. And I had to learn Dutch while I lived in Holland. I've forgotten more than I learned, but it's still there. And I read Russian and have a fairly elementary ability to speak it if I must, but I study all my scores in Russian from that point of view. So that's me. Now, I'm not suggesting that anybody else has to do that in order to conduct, but I just happen to love languages. And so I've pursued them all my life the way I pursue music. So many rehearsals in the international opera world sound like the Tower of Babel. If you go to a city, in some of the cities where I've worked, Paris, New York, Vienna, Milan, London, you'll have international singers. Some may be Italian, some may be German speaking, some may be French speaking, some speak Slavic languages or Russian. And in the end, people find their way to communicate in whatever language works best for those individuals. And so sometimes you may come into a rehearsal, and if you were sitting there and observing it, there are a few languages going all at once. However, the opera at hand is in one language, and that tends to be the dominant language if the singers are native of that language. Also, of course, remember that English is now the international language, and so that serves for many rehearsals in many countries. Now, here's a great question from a friend of mine and a colleague of mine. He's Gene Pokorny. He is the solo tuba player of the Chicago Symphony. He's been there for over 30 years. I believe he's born in California. I believe he went to USC. I've heard Pasadena somewhere mentioned in our many conversations over the years that I've been conducting the Chicago Symphony, which is now many, many years, 45 years perhaps. So Gene writes to me, "Greetings from Chicago. The year 2024 will be the centennial celebration of the premiere of Puccini's Turandot. I am sure plans to perform it in LA are well underway. Most opera fans know that this is the last opera was left unfinished by Puccini. Current performances usually end with an ending composed by Alfano, Berio more recently, and occasionally some others. The LA Opera is in a unique position of being able to place one of the many Hollywood composers. Where better than to have you and the last notes come from with a new conclusion to this amazing opera? Best wishes. See you in Chicago. Thank you, Gene. And I think we've had this conversation before in person while I've been with you at the symphony. Turandot is the problem because it wasn't finished. And so this question may never be finished. Now, do we need another ending? We have become accustomed to hearing the ending by the composer Alfano, who finished it after Puccini's death. However, we've actually never heard we rarely hear the complete Alfano, because Arturo Toscanini, who was conducting the premiere, made his own cuts and shortened it, and some of it doesn't quite make as much sense as you would want it to, either musically or dramatically. So what are possible solutions? One solution is to play not the version of Alfano that we know, but the uncut version that was original, cut by Toscanini. Another version is by Luciano Berio, and that is now been performed in several places. Do we need another version at the end of this opera? Well, here I am of two minds. I always love creation, but I think in general, it is very difficult for a composer, and particularly a great composer with a strong personality, to reproduce a work in the style and in the emotional climate of another era. This is 100 years old now. There are some great examples where, for instance, the two operas of Modest Moszkowski, Boris Godunov and Chovanchina, were left in a state that needed some fixing. So Rimsky-Korsakov wrote another version orchestration. Now we have the original version, and that can be preferred. But in another case, Chovanchina, Moszkowski never orchestrated it. So again, we have a version with orchestration, which is Rimsky, and we have a much newer one from Shostakovich, who orchestrated the original. Now, that's the one I prefer because he didn't change the music. Rimsky changed the music. And that is hard. But in both cases, at times, it is hard not to feel the presence of a genius. Rimsky-Korsakov was a genius. Shostakovich was probably the greatest genius of Russian music of the 20th century. And it's very hard to hide your fingerprints on those works. So I'm not sure if it isn't better to go back to the original Alfano as a variant than it is to commission somebody else. However, Gene, it's great to hear from you. And if you still disagree with me, that's fine. We can take that up the next time I see you in Chicago. Here's a question from a singer, Talia Moore Shearer. How can we break ageism in opera? There is a trend that you see in young artist programs that tend to shut out a lot of singers, sopranos really, if you're past a certain age. And that sort of, I guess, stigma of it, you aren't done with your training and singing by your 30s, then you aren't going to make it. So thank you, Talia. That's a very important question for a lot of people. And I'm going to actually invite in my colleague and friend, Josh Winograde, who's the Senior Director of Artistic Programs, and he is deeply involved in casting for LA Opera, and he is equally deeply involved in the Young Artist Program, where he meets and hears a lot of young singers. So I want to let him comment on this before I give you my answer.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you, Talia, for the question. It's a great question, and one that we hear a lot from, especially from young singers who are interested in the process. I think first and foremost, we feel in this industry, we all acknowledge that we are here for great singing, right? And I think so first and foremost, I think that the opera industry has really embraced good singing above all else. And for that reason, it's achieved a kind of flexibility when it comes to casting. Some great examples would be all of the legendary sopranos that we know of who sang roles like Mimi and Juliet, roles that are very specifically kind of from a dramaturgical level, very specifically young women, but these incredible artists who, because of the freshness of their singing and because of their vocal stamina, managed to sing these roles up until their retirement 50s, into their 50s. I think, the kind of embracing of that flexibility has also informed the industry at the Young Artist Program level. But you are right that the Young Artist Program specifically tend to be a vehicle to help a singer transition almost immediately from the kind of final academic pursuit into a professional career. So somebody just finishing their last degree that they intend to pursue, undergraduate, graduate school, artist diploma, DMA, that kind of thing. And so the Young Artist Program circuit tends to kind of profile singers in their 20s, between 20 and 30. However, one thing I would encourage you to do is, if there are unique circumstances, for example, something on a personal level that took you out of the field for a few years, military service, having a child, that kind of thing, are things we hear about pretty frequently. I think my colleagues and I are absolutely willing to kind of understand why it is that after pursuing the academic portion of your career, you needed to take some time off becoming the Young Artist Program. So I would encourage you absolutely to reach out to whoever you're applying to sing for and just give a little personal explanation. I think the people I know on my side of the table are always willing to hear that. Good luck.
Thank you, Josh, for your perspectives. And I'd like to add a few thoughts of my own. Ageism is an important question in the performing arts and the interpretive arts. And music, classical music in particular, is really not subject to age in the same way, let's say, that acting, particularly screen acting, where it's very difficult to get an 80-year-old to play a 20-year-old. Josh did point out that because the voice is the essential vehicle of the interpretation of a role, we have always tended in opera to not notice age as much as in other art forms. Movies changed everyone's attitudes about expecting the singers to look like the characters. But nevertheless, the singing is and was the main vehicle. And there are no ages. One of the beautiful things about music and collaborating, and I collaborated as a young person. I started conducting in my early 20s, and I was the young one all the time. And it wasn't as easy in those days as it is now. And now I'm on the other end of that spectrum, and I collaborate with very young people in their 20s, sometimes in their teens. And the magic and the miracle of music is that it erases age. When you're up there on stage, you don't have ages. It doesn't exist. The music unites the performers and unites the listener. And so ageism exists in certain regards, but actual age does not. And I'm really thinking about Talia as a young singer and the many other young singers who are concerned about this. Is there an age which is too old? Is there an age when I have to give up? Is there an age when it's finished? And my answer to young people, not at all. Do not let that discourage you. You should keep going forward. And I would have given that answer last year, but I'll give it with double force now that we are living through the COVID crisis, because all schedules are off. We don't know what the future holds now. We don't know how long it will take for the world in general, the music world specifically, to be back and running as we knew it. And so There is no schedule now. The important thing for you is to study, to cultivate your voice, to cultivate your musical skills, your linguistic skills, your acting skills, and hopefully you're going to be able to put them to use at whatever age. And I think that that's the best approach. Now, related to that a little bit is a question from Nicholas Sack Walden. How have vocal fox changed over the years? Have agreed upon vocal types gotten lighter, darker, stay the same? Now, thank you for that question, Nicholas. Now, I have to start by explaining the word Fach to the audience, to those who might not be familiar with it. It's a German word, and it is a categorization of an operatic voice. These categories have been created not by nature, but by practicing opera companies. And it's a way just simply to to organize thinking. So there are light sopranos, leggero sopranos, said in Italian. There are dramatic sopranos. There are mezzo sopranos. There are dramatic mezzo sopranos. There are lyric sopranos. There are spinto tenors. That means that's a dramatic tenor. There's a baritone Martin, which is a special kind of baritone with very high extension. There's a basso profondo, that's, as the word suggests, is a very low and deep voice. There are bass baritones. Now, I would like to start by saying I think that the Fox system is false, because the miracle of the human voice, singing voice, is that every individual is different. And all of those wonderful voices exist on a spectrum that goes like that. They're not born in categories. You can be two categories at once. And so I think it's a big mistake to limit a singer by saying, well, you're not a lyric soprano, you're a dramatic soprano, therefore I won't hire you to sing, I don't know, Mimi or Rusalka. Well, says who? That's not what the issue is. The issue is the particular timbre of your voice appropriate for the music of Puccini, Dvorak, Rossini, Verdi, Wagner, Debussy, Mozart. That's the issue. And voices are also flexible. Singers are flexible. And I don't believe that any of us should be limited by our idea of a category. You, a singer, are not a category. You are not a member of a category. You are an individual, a special individual with a special voice and a special talent. And that is the instrument, and that is you. And I would say to any singer listening to this, don't let the idea of Fach limit the possibilities and the capabilities that your voice has. And I've saved the last question for Wagner. Now, this is an anonymous question. So, Karl Dahlhaus, who of course was a great writer, teacher, musicologist, composer. Karl Dahlhaus says that the second act of Die Walküre fails dramatically because it has two catastrophes in it. Wotan submitting to Fricka in the first scene, and then Siegmund dying in the fifth scene. Is the act overstuffed, overlong? What is the most dramatically perfect act in Wagner? Well, very rich question, and thank you for that. Now, first of all, as for the problem of a massive act, and we all know that Wagner, length is not an issue to him. He takes as long as he needs to in order to present his music dramas. The problem of the two catastrophes, which are correctly identified in this question, in Act 2, was a problem that was recognized by Wagner himself, and it can be found in a letter to Franz Liszt. He was aware of the fact that there were basically two stories going on at once in Die Walküre. One story was about the so-called Welsungen race, that is to say, of the hero and heroine of our first act, twins who have been separated from birth, who find each other and who actually fall in love with each other, and by committing incest, conceive of Siegfried, who's going to become, of course, a key character in the third and fourth parts of the Ring of the Nibelungen. So that's one story. What happens to Siegmund and Sieglinde? And that story occupies the entire first act and a very important part of the second act. Now, superimposed at the beginning of the second act comes the story of the gods. Wotan, who is the chief god, like Zeus in the Greek myths, his wife, Fricka, who is also the goddess of home and hearth, one of his many daughters, Brunhilde, who is a Valkyrie. She's a sort of warrior maiden. She has a dozen other sisters whose mother is not Fricka, but Mother Earth, who's known as Erde. And that story gets started in Act 2. And that's the story that we're going to be left with in Act 3. And that's the story that's going to continue on in the last works of Siegfried and Die Götterdämmerung. So is that a problem? I don't think it's a problem. It is a challenge. When performing this, the conductor has to have a great sense of the big arc of an act. So this is no longer as it would be to conduct an aria or conduct a single movement of, let's say, a symphony or a piano concerto. This is constructing an arc that lasts sometimes 70 minutes, 80 minutes, and how to pace yourself, how to build that. Where are your climaxes? Where are the mountains? Where are the valleys? How do you balance them? How do you make them work? And I believe you do this best by accepting the structure as the composer left it. I never feel as an interpreter it's my place to stand over a work and to criticize it and to correct it. I feel as a interpretive artist, and I don't like that word interpretive because I feel it's abused a lot. Our primary function is to understand, to present the work as it is. So I am not troubled by the overlapping of two stories, one which has a catastrophe of a sort for Wotan, and one which is, in fact, the end of the story of the Welsungen of Siegmund, who will be murdered in the second act, and his wife Sieglinde will die sometime into the third act after having delivered the baby who is Siegfried and who will go on to be key to the rest of the ring. So it's also never a question to me, is a work perfect? Sometimes it's possible to listen to a work and marvel at its perfections and their balance and their inner harmony. And it's hard for me to listen to almost any piece of Mozart, be it a symphony, be it a concerto, a piano sonata, that is not perfect. But then again, you get into different problems with operas because operas have a dramatic reality and a musical reality. Is it important to be perfect? My answer, it is not important to be perfect. I'm not interested in perfect. I am interested in dramatic truths. I am interested in musical inspiration. It's very hard to find perfect works if you want to put it through that test. But you did ask a question, do I think that there's an act in Wagner's output that is perfect? And I'd have to say, yes, I think the first act of Die Walküre is perfect. And what do I mean by that? It exposes certain challenges, characters. Here's their dilemma. Here's what they have to experience. Here's what we learn about them. And it builds that to a climactic end. And then that is complete. In my mind, there's not a note too many or too few in the first act of Die Walküre. I would say the same for the second act of Tristan and Isolde. If I had to, it's very hard to find a perfect opera, but if I had to choose one from the Italian repertory, I'd say Gianni Schicchi, which is Puccini's only comedy. And again, from beginning to end, there's nothing superfluous and there's nothing that's missing. And if there is a perfect opera of Giuseppe Verdi, it's either Otello or Falstaff, where the inspiration never lags. There's nothing really that should be cut, and there's nothing really missing. So I think that the idea of perfection is also an impossible ideal, and it's not necessary for it to be achieved any more than a perfect performance. Is there a perfect performance? I say no, there isn't, because whatever performance you have just given of a work, you have had to make choices. These choices involve eliminating some ideas and accepting others. So those others could have been used. Therefore, you have never fully executed or realized the potential of any work, in particular masterworks. There is always another way, and beside which there's always another day. So speaking of another day, you've been really kind to look in today for Conlon. Don't think I took a sip of this while I had it. I hope you've been able to enjoy your coffee, enjoy the questions. Please keep sending them in to us. As you see, we had really great questions this time. Thank you to all of those who did write, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next occasion.